The storm rolled in just after dusk, a cold spring squall dragging its fingers across the high plains like a restless spirit. Rain came first, in soft, searching spatters, then in heavy silver sheets that bent the sagebrush flat. Laurel Byon watched from the doorway of her sod house, arms crossed against the wind's sharp bite, the lantern at her feet casting a fragile glow. She hadn't meant to be out there so long, just a quick step to gather in the chickens, but the sky had split open before she could finish, and now the coop door rattled loose on its hinges. She made a run for it, skirts tangled in her boots, breath curling in the chill. Thunder cracked just as she secured the latch, a sound so close it felt personal. By the time she reached her porch again, the wind had turned mean, tugging at her hair like an angry hand. Then she saw him. He came stumbling out of the darkness like a man conjured from the storm, tall, soaked to the bone, blood on his brow, eyes wide with the wildness of flight. No horse, no coat, just a threadbare shirt clinging to him like a second skin and the hollow look of someone who hadn't known safety in days. Laurel froze, one hand on the doorframe, the other reaching instinctively for the rifle just inside the door. He saw the motion and raised his hands, palms out, like a man who'd already lost too much. "I'm not here to take anything," he said, his voice rasped, rough as split timber. "I just need shelter for the night." Lightning gave shape to the desperation in his face, lit up the gaunt stretch of his cheeks and the mud caked on his boots. He was younger than she'd first thought, no more than 30, though wear had aged him at the edges. She hesitated. Out here, kindness was a currency too easily spent and too rarely returned. But he didn't plead, didn't beg, just waited, wind pushing at him like it wanted him gone too. Laurel stepped back. "Come in," she said. He sagged only a little, but she saw it. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting soft gold over the packed earth floor. Laurel grabbed a towel from the hook by the stove and tossed it to him. "Dry off," she said, "but stay where I can see you." He nodded, too cold to argue, and began wiping the rain from his face, leaving streaks of blood and grit in the towel's white weave. She didn't ask how he got the cut. Not yet. Instead, she poured water from the kettle into a tin mug and pushed it across the table. His hands trembled as he took it. "My name's Laurel Byon," she said after a pause. "This is my land." He looked up. "Matthew. Just Matthew. For now." They sat in the uneasy quiet, wind still battering the shutters. Laurel stirred the stew pot with slow, steady motions, every now and then glancing toward the stranger warming himself by the fire. He was careful not to move too fast, not to reach for anything, as though he understood exactly what it meant to be a man with no name on a stranger's land. Night thickened around them. Laurel gave him a bowl of stew and a chunk of bread. He ate with a kind of aching hunger, but didn't speak more than a thank you. When the wind died, it left a silence almost heavier than the storm. She watched him from across the fire, reading the shape of his wounds and the way he flinched at every creak of the timbers. "You running from something?" she asked finally. He looked at her, then away, from someone. She waited. He didn't go on. "You'll sleep in the shed tonight," she said. "It's dry, and I'll leave you some blankets. Come morning, you'll be on your way." He nodded, but she saw something shift in his eyes then, not surprise, resignation. As he turned to go, the sound of hooves came fast and hard over the rise, a dozen riders or more slicing through the night. Laurel's blood turned to ice. She stepped to the door, rifle in hand, heart hammering in her throat. "Matthew," she said, sharp and low. He spun, face gone pale. "They found you." He didn't answer, didn't need to. Laurel thought fast. There wasn't time to send him out the back, not without being seen. The riders were almost to the yard. She heard voices now, men barking orders, someone shouting, "Surround the house." She turned to him. "Take off your boots, sit at the table." "What?" "They think you're alone. I won't let them search this house like it's theirs. If you're my husband, they got no cause." He stared at her, eyes dark and stunned, but he obeyed. Laurel threw open the door just as a man stepped onto the porch. He wore a deputy's badge and the smirk of someone used to getting answers. "Even in, ma'am," he said. "We're looking for a fugitive, dangerous man, seen anybody pass through." She stepped out, rifle cradled in her arms. "Just me and my husband tonight, deputy." Behind her, Matthew coughed once, the sound muffled. She didn't turn. The deputy narrowed his eyes. That right. She held his gaze. That's right. And in that moment, beneath the hard stare of the law and the sharp wind of spring, Laurel Byon became a liar to save a man she barely knew. But it wouldn't be the last lie she'd tell for him. The deputy didn't blink. Neither did Laurel. The rain had eased to a damp hush, but the men behind him fidgeted with their reins, eager-eyed and armed, their silhouettes stark against the pale gray wash of early night. Laurel's grip on the rifle never wavered, though her fingers ached from the strain. "You sure about that?" the deputy said, voice oily smooth. "This man, we got word he passed through Iron Creek, heading west. Fits the description. Tall fella, dark hair, wounded. You seen anything out of the ordinary, ma'am?" Laurel tilted her chin. "Only thing out of the ordinary is you lot waking decent folks at this hour." The deputy's smile thinned. He stepped closer, the worn wood of the porch creaking beneath his boots. "No disrespect, Mrs. Laurel McKenna," she said. The name came before she could think, borrowed from an old ache she hadn't spoken in years. "My husband's name is Matthew." Behind her a chair scraped softly. She knew he'd heard. The deputy nodded slowly, like he was chewing on her words. "Well then, maybe we'll have a word with Mr. McKenna." She moved before he could, body blocking the doorway. "He's sick," she said flatly. "Fever hit yesterday. I don't want him catching more out here." The deputy's hand drifted to the butt of his revolver, a quiet threat. Laurel stared him down. "You planning to search every house between here and Wyoming, or just the ones with widowed women?" That landed, a pause settled, thick and taut. Finally he tipped his hat. "Ma'am." She didn't lower the rifle until they'd ridden off into the dark, hooves fading like thunder headed elsewhere. Inside, the quiet was deafening. Matthew stood by the table, barefoot just as she'd told him, his face unreadable. The fire cast long shadows behind him, and Laurel felt suddenly exposed, every breath a reminder of what she'd just done. "You didn't have to lie," he said, after a long beat. She set the rifle down slowly. "I know." "Why did you?" Laurel busied herself with the kettle, needing her hands to move. "Because you were about to get shot in my yard, and I've seen enough blood for one life." He said nothing. She poured tea she didn't really want, handed him a cup, took the other for herself. They drank in silence, each trying to make sense of the other. He was the first to speak. "You pulled that name out like it had weight to it." Laurel stared into her cup. "It did, once. Your husband died 2 winters back. Fever, took the baby with him." Matthew didn't answer, just nodded, the kind of nod that knew grief too well to touch it. That quiet recognition was harder to bear than pity. "I won't stay long," he said, "just until I figure a new route west. They're hunting me hard." Laurel sat across from him. "What did you do?" He looked down at his hands, calloused and cracked, stained faintly with dried blood. "Nothing they'd believe." "Try me." "I testified," he said, "against a man who owns half the county line back in Missouri. He killed a freedman over a gambling debt, then pinned it on a ranch hand. I saw it happen. I swore I wouldn't keep quiet." She watched him. His eyes were steady now, no flinch in them. "They called it perjury," he went on. "Said I lied to smear a good man's name. The sheriff helped them, so did the judge. I ran because staying meant a noose." Laurel breathed out slow. "That's why they want you." He nodded, "But it won't matter to them what the truth is." She leaned back, studied the firelight playing across the walls. Outside, the storm had passed, but it sent lingered, wet earth and cedar smoke. "You can stay," she said finally, "not just the night." Matthew blinked. "You trust me that much?" "No," she said plainly, "but I figure the law's already seen us as married. We play it right, you disappear slower. Might buy you time to figure your next step." "You'd do that for me." She met his gaze. "I'd do that for me. I got enough ghosts on this land, one more won't hurt." He gave a low, dry laugh. "You've got grit, Laurel McKenna." She rose and gathered the dishes, her face unreadable in the low light. "Then you better learn how to play the part," she said over her shoulder. "Husband." The next morning came with sunlight sharp enough to sting and a stillness that felt more like tension than peace. They moved around each other carefully, learning the shape of this new lie. Matthew chopped wood like it mattered, sweat beading at his temples despite the chill. Laurel milked the cow and mended fence posts, eyes always scanning the horizon. Word would spread fast. People talked in these parts. A widow suddenly married again to a man nobody'd seen before. It wouldn't sit quiet for long. Already her neighbor's boy had ridden past slow, eyes curious. Laurel watched him go, then glanced back at Matthew, who stood in the yard like he was waiting to be swallowed by the land. "Your name's Matthew McKenna now," she said quietly. He turned toward her. "And this lie," she added, "only works if you stop acting like you're ready to run." He nodded once, eyes softer now. They were strangers still, but not for long. The next Sunday brought visitors. They came in a wagon with a broken wheel spoke and a pie wrapped in muslin. Elijah and Ruth Whittaker, old neighbors from 2 ridges over, church folk, hard-worn and cheerful. Laurel had shared harvests with them in lean years, traded salt for kerosene when roads were snowed in. They came with the same easy familiarity as always, but this time their eyes lingered longer. "Well, I'll be," Elijah said, tipping his hat as he climbed down. "You didn't say nothin' about remarryin', Laurel." Laurel forced a smile, heart thudding like a snared rabbit. Didn't figure it needed sayin'. Things happened fast. "Don't they always?" Ruth said, already pulling her shawl tighter as she stepped into the yard. "You must be Matthew. Heard you were feelin' poorly the other night." Matthew nodded from where he stood near the woodpile, shirt sleeves rolled up, axe paused mid-swing. He wiped his hands on his trousers and stepped forward. "That's right," he said, his voice just gravelly enough to suggest lingering illness. "Laurel nursed me through it." Ruth gave him a quick, appraising glance. "Well, you got yourself a good woman." "I know it." Laurel turned quickly toward the house. "Come inside, there's coffee on." She kept her hands busy, slicing bread, refilling cups, tucking wild strands of hair behind her ears, anything to keep from letting the lie settle too heavy between them. Matthew sat across from Elijah, speaking in careful, measured tones, saying little but enough. He talked of Montana's high ridges and working cattle for a man named Pruitt who didn't really exist. His accent softened when he spoke, words worn down like river stones. Laurel watched the way he fit himself into the lie, not easily, but deliberately, like a man smoothing the edges of a borrowed coat. Not once did he meet her eyes. When the Whittakers left, Ruth pressed Laurel's hands between her own. "I'm glad for you," she whispered. "You deserve something good." Laurel smiled because that was what people did. She stood on the porch until their wagon vanished down the track, dust curling behind it like smoke. When she turned back inside, Matthew was stoking the fire. "You talk like someone who's been married a while," she said. He looked up, brow furrowed. "That a compliment?" Laurel shrugged, an observation. "I had a sister," he said after a pause. "Helped raise her after Ma died. She used to say I was bossy as an old hen." There was something tender in his voice, something unguarded. She hadn't expected that. "You close with her." "Used to be, before I left Missouri." He didn't explain further. She didn't ask. That night sleep was slow in coming. The cot in the shed had grown too cold with spring's fickle turns, and she'd brought him a blanket without a word. Later, she heard him shifting in the dark beyond her window, and for reasons she didn't fully understand, she called out, "You can sleep in here." Silence, then footsteps, slow and careful. He didn't touch the bed, laid down on the braided rug instead, arms crossed behind his head. She didn't argue, just lay back and stared at the rafters above. "Why'd you leave?" she asked quietly. A long breath, because I couldn't live knowing I'd done nothing. Laurel turned her face to the wall, heart aching in places she thought had long gone numb. In the days that followed, the lie grew roots. They planted early beans and strung wire for the tomato cages. Matthew repaired the gate that had hung crooked since winter. Laurel found herself asking for his opinion on the hay yield, the orchard's bloom, the oiling of harness straps. He was quick to learn the rhythm of her days, where the fox dens were, which hen laid the pale blue eggs. He didn't try to lead, just followed the land with quiet reverence. The days lengthened, so did the silences between them, but they no longer felt hollow. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Matthew brought her a bunch of wild columbine, stems tied with twine. He didn't say a word, just set them on the table and went back to sharpening the plow blade. She stood there long after he'd gone, the flowers trembling slightly in the draft from the door. The next morning, news rode in on the back of a ranch hand from town. Laurel was out front repairing a fence post when he stopped at the gate, hat in hand. "You hear about the break-in?" he asked. She frowned, "No." "Livery stable in Red Rock. Man got knifed. Witness says it was a stranger, tall, dark hair, looked like he was moving fast." Laurel's blood ran cold. She glanced toward the barn, where Matthew was brushing down the mare. "You think they'll come this way again?" she asked. The hand shrugged. "Law don't rest long. If they're looking hard, they'll be back soon enough." When he rode off, Laurel walked to the barn slow. Matthew looked up, saw her face. "They're coming again," she said. He didn't ask how she knew. This time there'd be no room for lies. The wind shifted that evening, carrying with it the sour scent of coming rain and the sharper edge of something else, unrest. Laurel could feel it in her bones, the way older folks sometimes claimed they could feel the weather change. A pressure behind the eyes, a tightening in the chest. It wasn't fear exactly, but something close to it, something that remembered. Matthew was oiling the hinges on the shed door when she stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee. The silence between them had become companionable of late, not strained. But now it carried weight again. "They'll be back soon," she said. He nodded, "I know." "What'll you do?" Matthew set the oil can down with care. "I've been thinking on that." He took the coffee, fingers brushing hers. She didn't flinch. "I could run again," he said. "There's a freight route heads north, takes a man through back hills and mining country. If I move before dawn, they might lose me." Laurel sipped her coffee, then looked out toward the horizon. A hawk circled far above, barely more than a flicker against the clouds. "And if they catch you? Then it's the end of the line." She turned to him. "So you'd rather keep running, keep lying?" He met her gaze. "You tellin' me to stay?" "No," she said and set her cup down. "I'm telling you to stop running." He didn't reply, but the flicker in his eyes said more than words could. That night they sat at the table without speaking. She patched an old quilt with small, steady stitches. He whittled a spoon from a scrap of pine. It was the quiet of people deciding without yet saying what the decision was. By morning, it was made. They rode into Red Rock together. The town was nothing more than a crossroad of stubborn buildings, false fronts and sagging porches, dust curling in lazy eddies where no rain had come yet. Laurel hadn't been there in near a year, not since the last feed delivery. Folks stared. Some offered polite nods, others squinted like they were trying to place a man they'd never seen before. Matthew kept his head low, hat brim shading the bruises still fading at the edge of his jaw. He walked beside her, close but not touching, as they stepped into the sheriff's office. The man behind the desk was not the one who'd come to her house. This one was older, heavy-set, with eyes that had long ago stopped believing in simple truths. "What can I do for you?" he asked, voice dry as sand. Laurel spoke first. "My husband has something to say." The sheriff's eyes flicked to Matthew, then back to her. "That's so." Matthew stepped forward, voice even. "My name is Matthew Harper. I came from Jackson County, Missouri. I gave testimony in a murder trial. The man I spoke against has been hunting me ever since." The sheriff leaned back, folding thick arms over his belly. "And you think I'm gonna believe that?" "I don't care if you believe it," Matthew said, "but I'm tired of running." Laurel stepped beside him, chin high. "He's been living honest, working land with me. Folks round here know what kind of man he's been." The sheriff considered them both, then spat into a tin. "I'll wire the marshal's office, see what they know. If it's true, someone'll come for you. If not, well, you're lucky we ain't hanging men without trial here." They spent the night in town. The sheriff let Matthew sleep in a cell with the door unlocked, said it was just for appearances. Laurel stayed at the boarding house, staring out a window that looked over the livery stable. She couldn't sleep, not knowing what news might come, not knowing what would be left of either of them by week's end. The next day passed slow, so did the one after. On the third, a wire arrived. The sheriff summoned them both to the office. He was already holding the paper when they entered, face unreadable. Laurel, Matthew, he offered a nod to each, then he read. Witness verified. Charges against the accused dropped pending further investigation. Local law officials advised to assist in protection of witness if necessary. He looked up. Seems you were telling the truth after all. Matthew's shoulders dropped just a little. Laurel didn't breathe. The sheriff tossed the wire aside. Word's gonna spread, though. You'll want to watch your back. That kind of man don't give up easy, even if the law says he's guilty. Matthew nodded. I know. They left town before supper. The sky had turned gold and purple over the flats, and wind teased at the wheat fields like a child playing tag. Neither spoke for a while. As they neared the edge of her land, Matthew reached out and touched her reins to stop her horse. She turned. Thank you, he said. His voice was rough. Laurel stared at him, quiet as dusk. You don't have to keep pretending anymore, he added. Not now. I know. So what now? Laurel looked out over the ridge. Her land stretched wide and weathered, stubborn and quiet like her. Now, she said, you decide if you want to stay a lie or become the truth. And then she rode ahead, not looking back. He followed. The days that followed were the kind that slid by without much sound, save for the wind in the grass and the clink of tools against earth. No one spoke of leaving. No one spoke of staying. But Matthew rose with the sun each morning and rode the fence-line like it was his name written across the hills, and Laurel let him. They fell into rhythm again. The lie had withered in town, but out here it bloomed into something quieter, something realer than either of them had expected. It wasn't romance, not yet, but something firmer beneath it, a presence, a choosing. One evening she found him on the south ridge, kneeling by the grave that marked where her husband and child lay buried. A simple wooden cross leaned slightly in the wind, and Matthew had set a fresh bundle of prairie sage at its base. Laurel didn't speak, just stood behind him until he rose. I didn't mean to intrude, he said. She shook her head. You didn't. They walked back together in silence, the long shadows of their bodies stretched over the grass like old threads finally weaving. But peace, when it comes too easy, tends to stir something darker from the dust. It was near the end of May when the rider came. A stranger with Missouri leather on his boots and a scar at the edge of his neck rode up without a word and leaned against the post like he was home. His eyes were black and narrow, and his voice carried the calm of someone who didn't need to raise it to make a point. Name, Cartwright, he said to Laurel after tipping his hat. I've been looking for a man who calls himself Harper. Laurel stood on the porch, arms crossed. Why? Cartwright smiled without warmth, because he saw something he wasn't supposed to, and men who see too much tend to forget that. Matthew stepped from the barn then, slow and sure. The hammer he held wasn't raised, but it wasn't idle either. Cartwright turned toward him, grin widening. Well now, you do look familiar. Laurel stepped between them, rifle resting light in her hands. This is my land, she said. You've made your point, time to leave. Cartwright looked her up and down, then tipped his hat again. You're braver than most. He turned his horse with a flick of the reins. I'll be back, he said over his shoulder, with others. When he rode off, Laurel's hands didn't shake, but her breath did. Inside, they moved quickly. She loaded shells while Matthew barred the doors. There weren't many bullets left, just enough to make a last stand look longer than it was. You don't have to stay, she said. He stopped, turned to her. I already stayed. They set watch that night, took turns sleeping in the rocking chair by the door. Laurel sat with her knees drawn up beneath a quilt, rifle across her lap. Matthew stood near the window, gaze fixed on the black ridge where Cartwright had disappeared. You ever kill a man? She asked. He didn't answer at first. Once, he said at last, war. I never have. You might have too. She nodded, I know. Dawn came slowly, burning through the low clouds like fire through linen, and with it they saw the dust. 3 riders this time. Laurel stood in the yard, Matthew beside her, both holding their weapons like the ground beneath them had become church. Cartwright rode in first, smile still sharp. Last chance, he called. Hand him over. Laurel didn't move. You'll ride out or you'll blade. Cartwright laughed. You think you can stop 3 of us? No, Matthew said, stepping forward, but you won't kill her before I kill you. Cartwright's smile faltered just a little. The standoff stretched. Wind pressed the wheat flat against the earth, like even it was holding its breath. Then a sound came, hooves from the east, another rider fast. Laurel turned, heart hammering. It was the sheriff from Red Rock. He rode in hard, rifle raised, badge flashing like a coin in the sun. Drop M's, he called, all of you. Cartwright didn't move, neither did his men. I said drop M. The second rider did, then the third. Cartwright stared at Laurel a long moment, then he spat in the dirt. Wasn't worth it, he muttered, and turned his horse. The sheriff watched them ride off, then lowered his gun and nodded to Laurel. Figured they might try something, thought I'd come see for myself. Laurel managed a breath, thank you. Matthew watched the horizon, the last dust trail curling into sky. They'll be back, he said. Maybe, the sheriff said, but they'll know now this place ain't theirs. He left as quick as he came. Laurel and Matthew stood in the yard long after, the wind pulling at their clothes. He turned to her, you could have given me up. She shook her head, and carry that weight. He smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd seen on him. They walked back to the house side by side, the sound of their steps soft in the dry grass. The storm had passed, but it hadn't broken them. Summer settled in with a hush warm and slow like molasses. The rains grew rarer, the sky stretched wider, and the wheat swayed gold in the fields, heavy with promise. Laurel woke before the sun most days and found Matthew already gone to the pasture, or returning with dirt on his hands and sleep still at the corners of his eyes. The days no longer felt borrowed. People stopped asking questions. Some came by with tools to lend, others with advice Matthew didn't always need. It was a quiet acceptance, the kind folks in these parts gave when they'd seen a man bleed for a place and choose to stay anyway. Laurel mended the back porch. Matthew built a second chicken coop without being asked. They rarely spoke of the past now, not because it had vanished, but because it had become something buried beneath the soil they turned together, something they no longer owed explanations to. One evening in late June, she found him by the well, shirt off, sweat slick on his back from hauling water for the garden. He stood in the low sun like he belonged there, boots braced against the cracked earth, and for the first time she let herself look without guilt. Water's still cold, he said, wiping his brow. She handed him a tin cup and sat on the edge of the well stone. The sky above them was violet with dusk, cicadas starting up their song. You miss Missouri? She asked. No. Why not? He took a long sip, then leaned against the post. Because it never saw me right, this place, it sees me. Laurel picked at a thread on her skirt. You think you'll always stay. Matthew looked at her, really looked, and she felt it like the sun warming her skin after a long, hard winter. If I have a say, he said, I will. And for the first time since she buried her first husband and child on that ridge, Laurel felt the fear begin to quiet. They planted sweet potatoes that week. Late, but the soil took them anyway. Matthew found a wild huckleberry thicket near the creek and brought back a pailful with his hands stained deep blue. She canned them while he carved new handles for the tools that had grown worn with use. He didn't ask to sleep in her room. He just stopped leaving at night. The first time he stayed by the hearth on the floor, then closer. Then one cool night in July, when the wind kicked up and lightning flickered far off on the prairie, he climbed into the bed beside her. She didn't speak. He didn't touch her. But he didn't leave, and that was something. Time passed like that, soft and steady. They built a bench for the porch. She taught him to knit rows in case the fall came early. He whittled her a comb with her initials burned into the back. One morning she caught him talking to her mare like it was an old friend, telling it how strong her temper was, but how good her heart. She didn't let him know she heard, just watched the way he stroked the horse's neck, the way the mare leaned into him like trust made flesh. In early September, the sheriff came riding again. Not fast, not urgent, but bearing a letter sealed with the mark of the Federal Circuit Court. Laurel held it with careful hands while Matthew read. The charges were gone, cleared, official now. The man who'd hunted him had died in another man's quarrel, shot in a bar fight down in Arkansas. No trial, no fanfare, just gone. Laurel looked up at him when he'd finished. "You're free," she said. Matthew folded the paper, slow and even. "I was free the day you let me in out of the storm," he said. "This just makes it legal." She nodded once, blinking hard. That night, under a sky thick with stars, he took her hand across the porch rail. "You never asked me to stay." "I didn't need to," she said. "But I need to ask," he said. "Laurel McKenna, will you marry me for truth this time?" She looked at him, this man who had once been a stranger with blood on his face and silence in his chest, and now was more home to her than the sod walls of her house. "Yes," she said. And though there were no witnesses, but the trees and wind and the coyote howling far off beyond the ridge, it felt more binding than vows in a church ever could. They were married in the yard the next day, just the two of them and the old mare standing still as a statue. He slipped a simple band of braided horsehair onto her finger. She gave him her father's pocket watch, the only thing she had of value that hadn't been bartered away. That fall they dug a new cellar, harvested early apples, laughed more. When winter came, it came hard, but they were ready. And when they sat by the fire, hands linked in the hush of a snow-covered night, neither of them spoke the word love. They didn't need to. They had chosen each other, every day, in every silence, in every storm. And that, at last, was enough.